Imagine grabbing your phone to take a quick photo or adjust the volume, only to accidentally trigger a feature you never wanted. We've all been there. Buttons might seem like the simplest part of a smartphone, but when they're done wrong, they can make you wonder, why did they even add this? Now, some brands have tried to shake things up by removing buttons entirely, pushing for a more seamless design that leans on touchscreen controls, but the result? Often, it doesn't quite hit the mark. When those buttons disappear, users start to feel the absence immediately. So while buttons might seem basic, they've become essential parts of our daily interaction with our phones. But here's the deal. Not all buttons are created equal. While some buttons just work, others have left users frustrated, confused, or even downright annoyed. Every smartphone brand has tried to add a unique twist to stand out, and sometimes the twist involves button innovation. But unfortunately, a lot of these experiments didn't exactly improve the experience. And that brings us to today's list of the worst smartphone buttons ever. We're about to go over some of the biggest offenders, the buttons that have frustrated, annoyed, and downright baffled users. So let's get into the flops that should have never been created in the first place. Kicking things off, when Samsung attempted to introduce their own assistant Bixby, they went all in by giving it its own dedicated button on flagship devices, starting with the Galaxy S8. Samsung clearly thought that Bixby could stand shoulder to shoulder with Google Assistant or Siri, but the reality was far different. Bixby, while functional, never quite clicked with users. Google Assistant was already deeply integrated into Android and had a far more polished experience. The Bixby button, on the other hand, became nothing but an accident waiting to happen. If you weren't paying attention, you'd find yourself triggering Bixby while trying to hit the volume or power buttons. Users immediately voiced their frustrations, demanding the ability to remap it, but by then, the damage was already done. Samsung eventually allowed users to remap the button in later updates, but the initial frustration was enough to leave a lasting negative impression. By the time Samsung finally removed the Bixby button after the S10 series, it had become a symbol of unnecessary innovation. Next, let's talk about Amazon's Fire Phone. A device that had all the right specs on paper, but it was ultimately a huge misstep for the retail giant. Designed to activate a 3D-like effect on the phone's screen, adjusting the display as you tilted or moved it. Sounds cool, right? In theory, yes, but in practice, it was a gimmick that failed to deliver any real value. The effect was clunky, underwhelming, and it really didn't provide any significant enhancement to the user experience. But what really made the dynamic perspective button a disaster was that it took up precious space that could have been better used for something more practical. It was a feature that felt forced and unnecessary, a flashy add-on that only distracted from the core purpose of a smartphone. Ultimately, the Fire Phone fizzled out, and that button became one of its more memorable features. Just another example of Amazon trying to push technology that nobody really needed. A similar button could also be found on the Red Hydrogen 1. A smartphone that aimed to bring holographic tech to your pocket, but ended up as a flop. Known for their high-end cinema cameras, Red marketed Hydrogen 1 as a 4V holographic display, and a haptic button was meant to control this 3D-like feature. The button was also supposed to work with other attachments, including a cinema-grade camera, that were promised but never released. Without these accessories, the button felt pointless and even frustrating, as it was easy to trigger by accident. Beyond the button's issues, the Hydrogen 1 was bulky, outdated, and failed to deliver on its modular promises. Instead of an innovative flagship, it became a symbol of overpromised features and unmet expectations, leading Red to abandon the smartphone market altogether. Moving forward to Google's attempt at squeezing out something new, no pun intended, we have the squeeze to launch Google Assistant feature on the Pixel 2 and 3. On paper, it was a neat way to summon your voice assistant, much better than Samsung's decision to have a whole dedicated button for an inferior voice assistant. You would just squeeze the side of the phone, and the Google Assistant would pop up. But here's the problem. It was incredibly easy to trigger. You could be holding your phone in your pocket or a bag, and suddenly Google Assistant would start responding to an unintended squeeze. It wasn't always responsive when you actually needed it, and many users found themselves frustrated with how unreliable it was. What started as a unique approach to accessing an assistant quickly ended up as a constant annoyance. So what did people do? They disabled the feature altogether, rendering the squeeze button effectively useless. Instead of enhancing your experience, it became a constant reminder of a great idea gone wrong. Moving to another bold idea, let's talk about HTC's experiment with pressure-sensitive buttons on the U12 Plus. In a world where physical buttons are starting to feel a little outdated, HTC tried to break the mold by removing traditional clickable buttons and replacing them with pressure-sensitive ones. These buttons, relying on haptic feedback rather than actual pressing, would activate functions when you applied a certain amount of pressure. but in practice, they fell short. The lack of tactile feedback made it incredibly difficult for users to know if they had actually pressed the button. You know that satisfying click when you press a button? Yeah, that was gone. And without that, interacting with the phone felt oddly disorienting and unreliable. It wasn't just frustrating in the moment, it led to long-term annoyance as users struggled to adapt to a system that was supposed to feel more futuristic, but ended up making tasks feel harder to do. HTC's experiment with these haptic feedback buttons was a good idea in theory, but it ended up feeling like a solution to a problem that didn't exist. Now, let's turn to the Sony Xperia series, a line of phones that's always prided itself on top-tier camera technology. Sony introduced a dedicated camera shutter button, thinking it would be a photographer's dream. For the hardcore camera enthusiasts, this was a great feature. A button that instantly triggered the camera app and made snapping photos more intuitive. And while some users appreciated the added functionality, for the average user, it was often redundant. In most cases, a simple tap on the screen did the job fine, and worse yet, the shutter button was placed in a spot that made it all too easy to accidentally press when you didn't mean to. While it didn't frustrate everyone, this dedicated button often felt like a niche addition that wasn't quite necessary for most users. Instead of being a universally loved feature, it became a reminder that not every button is essential, and sometimes less really is more. But if this button sounds familiar, it's actually because Apple introduced something similar in their iPhone 16 lineup with the camera control button. Apple's always been known for its streamlined, minimalistic approach to design, so the addition of this button raised some eyebrows. The button's meant to give quick access to camera functions, but here's the problem. It duplicates features that we've already seen on the screen. And much like Sony's camera button that we discussed, it's in a spot where it's just way too easy to press accidentally, especially when you're trying to hold the phone one-handed. Some users have praised the button for its convenience, but others find it redundant, especially considering how easy it is to activate camera settings directly from the screen. While Apple has a track record of creating useful features, this button really feels like it's trying to fix a problem that didn't really exist in the first place. It's just another example of a button that doesn't quite live up to the hype. So what's the takeaway from all of this? While physical buttons still have a place in smartphone design, it's clear that not every button adds value to the experience. In fact, as we've seen, some of these innovations only create frustration, whether through accidental presses, redundancy, or just gimmicky features that never caught on. Button design isn't about packing as many options as possible, it's about enhancing the user experience and making things easier, not more complicated. The key is to remember that buttons should serve a clear purpose, something essential and intuitive. Extra buttons can sometimes hurt the user experience, turning what should be a simple interaction into an annoying task. So next time a phone manufacturer decides to add a new button, we should probably be asking, is this really necessary, or are they just adding it for the sake of having something new? But with that, what do you think? Which smartphone button was the worst? Or maybe, do you actually think we need more unique buttons in the future? Make sure you subscribe for more similar content, and let me know what you think in the comments.